David, Claire, we might ask Claire what methods she used to find some of these interesting linguistic facts in her collection of texts. And one of the things that I know Claire would say is that she created a corpus of texts. So what she did was to download trials from the Old Bailey proceedings and to make her own set of texts that we call a corpus. And then she could use corpus linguistic techniques too, which is looking at language with the help of computers. And you've done that in your topic of research too, haven't you? So tell us a little bit about that.
Yes, well, what I did was I collected all of my texts from an online database of emails from employees in an American company called Enron, a former American energy company that went bankrupt in the early 2000s. And as part of the legal inquiry into why they went bankrupt, all the emails were made available online to the public. And from those, there was hundreds of authors, but from those, I focused on 4 authors, two males and 2 females, and they had different roles within the company. And 150 emails from each of those formed my corpus, my collection of texts. And from that, I then used the electronic computational tools, wordsmith tools, and CFL lexical feature marker. And that brought up the most common words that were used by all the authors. So that then was a useful entry point into which words they used the same and which words they only use, which is very interesting or essential to identifying authorship and individual style.
So one of the things that you were interested then in looking at these authors, you had 4 different authors and you wanted to find out which words they all used, all shared, and which words were unique to each author. Now, quite a lot of the words that we use every day, we all use all the time, don't they? In fact, about half the words that we use, we all share. Those are what we call the grammatical words, or if we think of words as a kind of brick wall, the bricks are what we call the lexical words, the content words, the nouns, the verbs, the adjectives. And the mortar in between the words, the grammatical words, they're the ones like and, the, is, that we use all the time. So all of those words usually make up about 50% of any text. We can test this, can't we? But when we test text, we find that most of the words, all of those 50% are used a lot of the time, aren't they? So they would be shared between all the authors. So the words that you were interested in were the lexical words, weren't they? The nouns, the verbs and adjectives. Some of those are going to be shared because we're talking about a business setting. What sort of words are shared between authors in your business emails then?
Well, 2 of the most important words that were shared by all of the 4 authors were please and thanks, which is probably not surprising considering the kind of interaction that will be going on between colleagues in the workplace via email. And then what I did then was to see how these words, individual words, were used in longer constructions to see if, although all authors used the words, whether they used them differently in the different contexts could be used to identify their individual styles.
Okay, so what you're saying is that we have individual or possibly different ways of saying please and thank you, of getting people to do things for us in the business setting. Any unusual ways of saying please stand out? Were there any of the authors that asked for things to be done in particularly distinctive way?
Yes, there was one gentleman that used please, comma, and then whatever he was requesting. And that just one little comma after the word please kind of distinguished him from the other authors in the corpus that I had. Another thing was how the authors or the writers of the email requested follow-up. So requested a reply from their recipient. So things like please let me know. And there was one author, everyone used please let me know, but one author used particularly longer and more frequently and more consistently certain structures.
You bring up this idea of consistency because one of the difficult questions when we're trying to find out whether there is such a thing as being able to attribute authorship to particular writers, is that we're not always consistent as writers, are we? So we don't always say, let's take, for example, our writer, please, comma. Did Mr. Please, comma, always use a comma after please? So how did you deal with this issue of consistency in looking at authorship then?
Well, the one main advantage is of having so many different texts and so many that the sheer frequency of and the amount of text that I had to quantify brought up more instances naturally.
Variation is also part of consistency, isn't it? Because say I use please, comma, plus please with no comma, we can see how many times I use it in. Your point is about taking a large sample. Yeah. So in the sample, is please, comma, the dominant mode, and how many variations? So if we take 4 authors, we're going to find that we are going to find variation because we don't always do things the same way. That would be too simple, wouldn't it?
Of course, yeah.
We would have nothing to study, would we, if language was that simple, but we do all vary. So one of the things that you can look for is how many variations does each author have. And that way you'll find that variation is actually part of consistency, isn't it? Yeah. Because one author might have only one way of doing things, or 2 or 3, but not the same patterns as the other author. That's what you're looking for, isn't it? Whether what the patterns are for each individual author. And
the important thing in then is not to focus on one feature, but to focus on the collective feature. So whereas one author might use a different way of saying please every time they use it, have a large variability, that combined with other things such as how they greet the recipients when they start emails, how they name the people that they're talking to, all of these considered together give more of an overall picture of the kind of style and a unique style that a person has.
So this word style then is an important aspect of authorship attribution, isn't it? Yeah. Working out whether an individual author has a unique style that is describable for them. It's interesting, isn't it, to think that as writers of email, we might be identifiable by the way we write and how we say it.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, well, we've talked about your individual research. These are just 2 examples of the sorts of things that we can do in forensic linguistics. What other sorts of things have you come across in your reading? What other studies have you found what other things do people look at in forensic linguistics?
Well, as part of my research for my project, I looked at people who had done questioning in police interviews, legal statutes.
Okay, so we don't just have to look at, you're looking at the historical situation, but one of the things, and there aren't many forensic linguists looking at the historical aspects of language, but many more people are looking at the contemporary setting, aren't they? So how does language work in contemporary police interviews is something that you've read about, and also the language of statutes. What's worth studying in the language of statutes? We might say that it's dull as ditch water, as a kind of prose. What's interesting about it?
Well, it is interesting to look at because then we can take apart all the very complex structures of statutes and legal language and discover why they're there and why they have to be so specific, so that lawyers can pick them apart and find loopholes and do their job with them.
Yeah, statutes are perhaps the kind of text that has the longest sentences, aren't they? Or they're famous for having very long sentences. So one of the things we can do is to find out exactly how long the sentences are. What's the average sentence length of a sentence in a statute? Is there a particular legal register in the choices of words that are used? And one of the things, and also in terms of layout, what do they look like as texts? What other things do people look at then? So police interviews, statutes, the language of statutes.
Similar to the statute is the contracts between two people, so maybe terms and conditions, those things that are very long and are rarely read.
Yeah.
Just clicked accept, especially online now, and how these type of things have to be all inclusive to kind of catch anyone who's doing anything against them, and with statutes and with contracts, the kind of power or restricted power that the people are given, the layperson is given, who are outside of the legal institution, how easily they can understand these type of texts and deal with them.
Yes, these are texts written by professional writers for the lay public, aren't they? So as the lay public, we interact with these texts, or perhaps don't every day when we click tick, I've read the terms and conditions. Yeah, so terms and conditions are an interesting text that we come across every single day that we perhaps don't think about how it's constructed linguistically.
So yeah, as David said, it is very important to relate forensic linguistics to the layperson, because even though we're looking at complex language and institutionalised language that we might not come across in everyday lives, it does on some level affect us all probably at some point.
Yeah. Now, one of the things that we've done is to talk about the descriptive area of forensic linguistics, so how we can describe language in historical settings or in a corpus of emails. One of the other things that we haven't really touched on in forensic linguistics is what forensic linguists sometimes do to interact with the public or the legal profession. So the other side of the story, perhaps, for forensic linguistics, apart from describing language in legal settings, is the way that forensic linguists might be hired, recruited to help in legal cases. So a case, for example, involving a disputed author, the research that has been done in authorship is very useful in enabling a linguist to give an opinion, perhaps in a case where there are two authors and one is disputed. Perhaps somebody wrote something that they didn't want to have attributed to them, and so had written it anonymously. We can think of cases where this might happen. And a linguist might be asked to give an opinion on whether the writing in that disputed case was the same as other samples of writing that writer is known to have written. So one of the things we're doing then is to push out the boundaries of finding out what legal language looks like, how it's written, and then to apply that in real world cases. And so what forensic linguists are doing is to build on the knowledge that's created through researching legal language in order to give opinions in court cases, and perhaps in cases that don't actually get to court because someone says, okay, fair cop, it was me.
Yeah.